back to Willow Creek. The train rolled slowly into Willow Creek, its wheels squealing gently as it came to a stop at the tiny station that hadn't changed in the 20 years since Ella had last set foot there. The platform was still made of worn timber, the paint on the handrails chipped and sun-bleached, and the little bench under the tin awning had the same initials carved into the side. Some teenage declaration of love, long since faded, but never forgotten. The warm summer air smelled of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass, and the sound of cicadas sang in the background like a lazy afternoon melody. Ella stepped off the train with her suitcase in hand, her heart caught somewhere between nostalgia and nervous anticipation. It had been too long. Life had swept her away, as it often does, into a whirlwind of meetings, deadlines, late-night emails, early morning commutes, and the steady buzz of city life that left little room for silence or reflection. She had spent so many years moving fast, chasing promotions, collecting keys to apartments that never truly felt like home, and convincing herself that she didn't have time to slow down. But something about her mother's last letter, written in careful loops on soft cream paper, had pulled at her in a way that nothing else had. It wasn't dramatic, just a gentle mention of how the roses were blooming early this year, how the back porch swing had started creaking again, and how the stars were still just as bright on clear nights. That was all it took. She'd packed a bag the next day, booked the train ticket, and now here she was, stepping back into a town that felt frozen in time, wrapped in golden sunlight and quiet beauty. The walk from the station to her childhood home was less than a mile, but she took her time, pulling her suitcase along the gravel path as she passed familiar sights that stirred something deep in her chest. The Willow Creek General Store still had the old Coca-Cola sign above the door and a bulletin board cluttered with flyers for bake sales, quilting circles, and lost cats. The post office had a fresh coat of white paint, but the inside was just as she remembered, with its rows of brass mailboxes and the soft clang of the little bell whenever someone opened the door. The bakery on the corner, once run by the Jensen family, still displayed its daily specials in the window. Blueberry muffins, peach cobbler, warm sourdough, and the smell of sugar and cinnamon drifted into the street, warm and welcoming. A few folks called out to her as she passed. "Ella, that you?" "Well, I'll be. You haven't changed a bit. Your mama's been talking about your visit for days now." She smiled and waved, feeling the warmth of being known again, not just as another face in a crowd, but as Ella, the girl who used to help out at the library, who once fell out of the tree behind the church and broke her arm, who played piano in the school concerts and wore her hair in a braid every summer. The trees arched overhead, creating a tunnel of green dappled with sunlight, and the air smelled of lilacs and clover. Birds sang from the telephone wires. Bees drifted lazily from flower to flower. By the time she reached her mother's house, her heart had already begun to settle. The old white cottage stood proud and sweet, surrounded by a riot of flowers that filled the yard with color. Zinnias, marigolds, sunflowers, and her mother's prized lavender bushes that sent a soft, calming scent into the air. The porch steps were freshly painted, though they still creaked, and the screen door let out its familiar squeal as her mother stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron, her face breaking into a smile that could melt any kind of worry. "There's my girl," she said, pulling Ella into a warm embrace that smelled of soap and sugar and home. "You got taller," Ella said, laughing into her mother's shoulder. "You just got shorter," her mother teased, brushing back her hair. Come in, come in. I've got a pie cooling and your old room waiting." The house was exactly as she remembered. The kitchen, with its yellow checkered curtains and wooden cabinets worn smooth from years of use, felt like stepping into a memory. The hallway still had family photos on the wall, snapshots of birthdays, school plays, summer picnics, and the scent of cinnamon and vanilla wrapped around her like a blanket. Her mother had made a peach pie, just like she used to every summer, and they sat at the round kitchen table sipping sweet tea, sunlight streaming in through the window and pooling on the table like honey. They talked for hours. Ella told her about work, about the city, about the noise and the rush, and how it never quite felt real. Her mother listened with patient eyes and soft nods, asking questions only when she needed to. In the afternoon, they walked through the backyard, past the garden rows of tomatoes and cucumbers, to the old swing under the willow tree. Ella sat and let the breeze push her gently back and forth, while her mother pulled weeds nearby, her hands still strong and sure. They talked about old times, how Ella used to collect fireflies in mason jars, how she once got lost in the cornfield and had to be rescued by the neighbor's dog, how her father used to sit on the porch every evening with a glass of lemonade and a tune on his lips. Later, they drove out to the lake, where the water was still and blue and dotted with lily pads. Ella took off her shoes and waded into the shallows, the water cool against her skin, the mud soft between her toes. Her mother watched from the dock, humming an old song, her feet swinging just above the surface. That night, they made supper together: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh green beans, and danced barefoot in the kitchen to a record that crackled on the old turntable in the corner. They laughed more than they had in years, and when the dishes were washed and the lights were dimmed, they sat on the front porch with mugs of coffee and watched the stars come out. The sky above Willow Creek was a deep, endless blue, peppered with constellations that Ella hadn't seen clearly in years. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and the hum of crickets filled the silence between their words. For the next few days, time slowed even more. Each morning began with coffee on the porch. Each afternoon brought a walk through town or a drive to a quiet place, a sunflower field, a hidden path, the old bookshop with dust-covered shelves and the smell of pages older than Ella herself. She ran into childhood friends, visited her old school, and even stopped by the library, where Miss Delaney, now retired but still sharp as ever, insisted she take home a copy of her favorite novel for old time's sake. Her mother showed her how to make blackberry jam from scratch, taught her how to knit the start of a scarf, and told her stories Ella had never heard before, about her own youth, about Ella's father, about the days when the world felt different but just as sweet. On her last evening, they set up a little picnic in the backyard with fresh bread, cheese, and slices of apple pie. They laid a blanket out under the stars and listened to the wind rustle the trees, and Ella knew, without needing to say it, that something inside her had changed. It wasn't just about coming home. It was about remembering that home was more than a place. It was a feeling, a rhythm, a slower heartbeat. It was quiet mornings and long afternoons, garden dirt on your hands, coffee that wasn't rushed, and conversations that didn't end in a hurry. When it was time to leave, her suitcase was heavier with jars of jam, fresh herbs, a hand-knitted scarf barely halfway finished, and the soft weight of peace she hadn't carried in a very long time. Her mother hugged her tightly at the train station, placing a folded note in her hand and a bundle of lavender in her bag. "Come back soon," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And not just for me, for you." Ella nodded, her throat too full to answer. As the train pulled away and Willow Creek faded into the golden distance, she looked out the window and smiled. She wasn't running anymore. She had remembered how to rest, how to breathe, how to feel. And in the quiet hum of the rails beneath her, she made a silent promise not to wait so long next time. Because home would always be there, nestled in the hills and gardens beneath the wide open sky of Willow Creek, waiting to welcome her back. Letters on Lavender Lane. Nina moved into the little stone cottage on Lavender Lane in the early days of autumn, when the air was crisp and filled with the scent of chimney smoke and dried leaves, and the trees painted the world in shades of rust, honey, and amber. After 35 years of teaching elementary school, mostly third grade, Nina had retired with a quiet heart and a plan to spend her days somewhere calm and beautiful, far from the rush and clamor of the city. The cottage was nestled at the edge of the town of Brook Hollow, where time seemed to move a little slower, where front porches still mattered, and people still smiled at strangers. The cottage wasn't fancy. It leaned slightly to one side, the wooden porch sagged at the corners, and the garden had grown wild with lavender, daisies, and forget-me-nots. But the moment Nina saw it, with ivy curling along the eaves and a single worn rocking chair on the porch, she knew it was home. The first morning in her new house was quiet. The sun rose over the hills, golden and soft, casting long beams of light through the trees that lined the gravel road. Nina woke to the sound of birdsong and the comforting tick of the antique clock in the hallway. She wrapped herself in her thick cardigan, padded into the kitchen, made herself a cup of tea, and stood at the window as steam curled from her mug. Outside, the world looked like a painting. A soft breeze stirred the lavender bushes along the fence, their fragrance drifting through the open window. After breakfast, curious if any mail had followed her from the city, Nina wandered down the little stone path to the mailbox at the edge of the property. Among the few forwarded letters and a real estate flyer was a pale pink envelope with no return address, no stamp, and a neat label that read, "To the kind soul who lives here." Intrigued, she opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in purple crayon, the words large and endearing, with small hearts drawn over the eyes. "Hello," it began. "My name is Lucy. I used to live in this house. I'm 8 now, but I was 5 when we had to move. I miss the lavender the most. If you are kind, please write back." It was signed with a doodle of a smiling sun and a tiny cat labeled Mr. Tumbles. Nina's heart melted. She hadn't expected to find such warmth tucked into a mailbox. That evening, after unpacking a few more boxes and setting up her little writing desk by the window, Nina pulled out a sheet of pale blue stationery and began her reply. "Dear Lucy," she wrote, "thank you for your beautiful letter. I feel so lucky to have found this home, and I'm happy to tell you the lavender bushes are still here and blooming beautifully. Your note made me smile. I would love to hear more about your time in this house. Sincerely, Nina." She placed the letter in an envelope, walked it out to the mailbox, and placed it carefully inside with a hopeful flutter in her chest. 3 days later, a new envelope appeared, this time green with sparkles on the flap. Inside was a drawing of the house and a short note. "Dear Miss Nina, I'm so glad you like the lavender. I used to help my mom water the plants. We had a swing in the backyard. Did you find it? It creaks a little. Mr. Tumbles liked to sleep under it. I hope he visits you too. Love, Lucy. That afternoon, Nina walked into the backyard and smiled as she found the swing tucked beneath the old elm tree, exactly where Lucy said it would be. It did creak when she sat in it, and though Mr. Tumbles was nowhere to be seen, she imagined him there, napping in the grass. From then on, Nina and Lucy began exchanging letters regularly. Lucy told her about her new school, her favorite subjects, how she missed her best friend Emma from Brook Hollow, and how she hoped to visit someday. Nina wrote about the tomatoes she was planting in the garden, the birds that came to the feeder outside the kitchen window, and the way the wind sounded when it blew through the leaves at night. Each letter brought with it something unique, a drawing of a flower, a homemade bookmark, a sticker collection carefully arranged on paper. Nina responded with dried lavender tied in ribbon, pressed autumn leaves, a simple sugar cookie recipe, and once a small watercolor painting of the cottage at sunset. Lucy said it looked like magic. As the weeks passed, Nina found herself waking each morning with excitement, checking the mailbox with the joy of a child. The letters filled her heart in ways she hadn't expected. Though she'd taught children all her life, these letters weren't about lessons or curriculum. They were about connection, wonder, and friendship. Lucy's words brought warmth and imagination into her days, and Nina's thoughtful replies gave Lucy someone who listened and cared. November came, bringing with it cool winds and early dusks. One letter from Lucy arrived with a drawing of a Thanksgiving table and a note that read, "We always used to eat by the window and see the trees. Do you eat there now? I think the light looks really pretty." Nina sat at that same window later that evening, her dinner plate before her and a candle flickering softly beside her glass. The trees were bare now, their skeleton branches swaying against the fading sky, and she felt tears prick at her eyes, not of sadness, but of deep, unexpected gratitude. Lucy's memories had become a part of her own. In early December, Nina received her favorite letter yet. It came in an envelope decorated with snowflakes and glitter glue and included a paper flower garden, carefully cut and folded from construction paper. Each flower had a tiny message inside. "You are kind. Thank you for taking care of the house. I miss the porch swing." There was also a photo, one of Lucy holding up a certificate of merit from school, smiling proudly. "I thought you'd like to see my face," she wrote, "because now you are my friend." Nina framed the photo and placed it on the bookshelf. That weekend, she baked Lucy's sugar cookies, packed them carefully into a tin, and mailed them to the return address Lucy had finally provided in a note signed, "Love, Lucy and my mom. Her name is Heather." A week later, just as the first real snow began to dust the ground, Nina heard a soft knock on her front door. She opened it to find a woman and a little girl bundled in scarves and smiles. "Hello," the woman said. "I'm Heather, and this is Lucy. She begged to come and meet you." Lucy stepped forward, her cheeks pink from the cold, holding a bouquet of hand-picked daisies and a new drawing. This one of the cottage with 2 stick figures on the porch, labeled me and Miss Nina. Nina's heart swelled. She knelt down and hugged Lucy gently, her eyes misting. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you in person," she said. "Would you like to come in for some hot cocoa?" They spent the afternoon together, warm and happy inside the little cottage. Lucy explored the garden paths she remembered, now dusted with snow. and Nina showed her the cozy reading nook she had set up in the window seat. They drank cocoa, talked about books, and laughed as if they'd always known each other. When they left, Lucy promised to write again soon, and Heather thanked Nina for being such a special friend to her daughter. That night, as the snow continued to fall gently outside, Nina sat by the fire with a quilt over her lap, sipping tea and staring at the glowing embers. On the table beside her was Lucy's latest drawing, framed now and resting beside a candle. The house felt fuller somehow, warmer, filled with the invisible thread that had connected her to a little girl who simply missed her old home. And Nina knew, deep in her soul, that kindness had crossed generations, that letters could be more than words. They could be bridges, lifelines, beginnings. Lavender Lane wasn't just a place on the map. It was a place where stories lingered in the breeze, where memories waited in the garden, and where one little letter changed two lives forever. Where the sky meets me. For most of my adult life, I believed the city was where you were supposed to end up. That if you worked hard enough, ran fast enough, and kept checking boxes and chasing deadlines, you'd eventually arrive at happiness. Like it was a train station waiting at the end of a long, crowded track. And for a while, I fooled myself into thinking I was close. I had the apartment with the skyline view, a job with a title that sounded important, and a calendar so full it became my personality. But somewhere in between the elevator rides, caffeine highs, and constant striving, I lost touch with myself. The change didn't come in one dramatic moment. It wasn't heartbreak or loss. It was something quieter, something like fatigue that went deeper than sleep, or an ache that didn't seem to come from anywhere specific. One morning, I stared at myself in the mirror, mascara perfectly in place, blazer pressed, and thought, who is this? Not in the way of curiosity, but in the way of grief. So I left. I packed what I could fit into my car, gave away the rest, and drove without a clear destination. I followed the quiet roads that rolled out like ribbons across golden fields. And when I came upon a little town called Wren Hollow, I stopped. Not because it looked like a dream, but because for the first time in a long time, it felt like breathing. One diner, one gas station, a library that leaned a little left. People waved from porches. Kids rode bikes barefoot. There was nothing glamorous about it, but something in me whispered, stay. So I rented a creaky cottage at the edge of town. It had ivy climbing the chimney and a porch swing that sounded like it kept secrets. The stillness was unsettling at first. I had no meetings, no deadlines, no one needing me to perform. My thoughts were louder than ever, like a room that echoed after all the furniture's been taken away. But slowly, the quiet stopped being a threat. It became a kind of freedom. And then, I met him. It wasn't some sweeping, movie scene moment. I was at the Saturday market, holding a jar of honey, debating whether I needed another candle I wouldn't light, when I heard a voice behind me say, "That one smells like summer in a jar." I turned and saw him, Levi. Tall, sun-worn, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd built things. He was wearing a soft flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up like he hadn't even tried. There was something about the way he looked at me, not as if I was a stranger, but as if he had been waiting for me to turn around. "I'm Levi," he said, offering a small, easy smile. "Hi, I'm new," I replied, and he laughed. I figured, "You got that look?" "What look?" "The kind that says you're trying to remember how to slow down." We talked for a while, then a while longer, then every weekend, then on weekdays too. He wasn't like anyone I had known in the city. He didn't fill silences just to avoid them. He didn't ask about my job title or care what I used to be. He listened, really listened. He built things with his hands, furniture, fences, even poetry, though he rarely admitted the last one. He took me fishing, even though I never caught a thing. I showed him how to make risotto, even though I overcooked it. With Levi, time felt different. He saw beauty in the small things, how the light hit the fields at dusk, the way the stars lined up above the barn roof, how a person's voice softened when they were safe. He didn't try to fix me or define me. He just made space for me to unfold. We spent countless evenings on the porch swing, sometimes talking, sometimes not. I'd lean against him, wrapped in a blanket, and he'd hum under his breath, something low and familiar. We never had to say it out loud. The feeling was there. I see you. I've been looking for you too. And slowly, I realized I hadn't just come to Wren Hollow to escape. I came to remember, to become, to find the pieces of myself that had been waiting in the quiet, and somehow to find him too. My soulmate wasn't someone I crossed paths with in a crowded subway or a networking event. He was someone who lived at the pace I was learning to love, who believed in good mornings and unhurried dinners and dancing barefoot in the kitchen on a Tuesday night. Together, we didn't make things perfect. We made things real. There were muddy boots by the door and mismatched mugs in the cupboard. There were quiet Sunday mornings and loud thunderstorms where we sat by the window, holding hands and watching the sky fall open. There were shared dreams, not of skyscrapers and corner offices, but of vegetable gardens, long drives, and maybe one day, little feet running through the grass. Sometimes people ask if I miss the city, and sometimes I do. I miss the noise, the buzz, the ambition, but not more than I love the sound of Levi's laughter when I burn the pancakes. Not more than I love this version of me, softened, whole, free. So here I am, in a small country town, where the sky meets me at eye level, where love showed up, not with fireworks, but with steady hands and honest words, where I learned that peace isn't something you earn, it's something you remember. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you find yourself and your soulmate in the same place, right where the road ends, and everything truly begins. The warmth of Maplewood Farm. The golden afternoon sun spilled across the rolling fields of Maplewood Farm, warming the old white farmhouse that stood proudly at the crest of the hill. The paint had faded some over the years, and the wraparound porch creaked when the wind swept through. But the house had aged with the kind of charm that only time and love could carve into wood. Ivy curled along the porch railings. The scent of freshly cut hay drifted lazily through the air, and 100 sunflowers in full bloom stood proudly in the field beside the red barn. On that particular September afternoon in 1957, all was calm. The rusted windmill turned slowly in the breeze, squeaking gently like a lullaby. The barn cats were sprawled on the sun-warmed stone path, their tails twitching now and then in sleepy contentment. A few chickens clucked lazily near the coop, and the occasional low moo from the pasture added to the peaceful rhythm of country life. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, which always smelled faintly of bread and cinnamon, Clara May hummed an old tune as she poured hot coffee into 2 thick porcelain mugs, the same blue and white speckled ones she and her husband Henry had used for the past 42 years. The aroma filled the room with deep comfort, mingling with the soft scent of apples baking in the oven. Outside the open window, lace curtains danced gently in the breeze. She wore her favorite yellow house dress, the one with tiny embroidered daisies around the collar, and her silver hair was twisted into a neat bun. Her hands, though worn and freckled with age, moved with grace as she set the cups on the tray, added 2 warm slices of buttered cornbread, and made her way out onto the porch. Henry was already waiting in his rocking chair, a wide-brimmed straw hat tilted back on his head, his overalls rolled up just enough to feel the sun on his ankles. His face bore the map of a life well lived, lines of laughter, decades of summer squints, and the peaceful wisdom that only comes from loving someone a very long time. "Well, there you are," he said with a slow smile, taking the cup she handed him. "Here I am," Clara replied, settling into the chair beside him with a content sigh. The porch creaked under her feet in a familiar way, like an old friend settling down beside her. They rocked in rhythm for a while, not speaking, just sipping and listening. The cicadas sang gently in the trees, and a pair of mourning doves cooed somewhere off in the woods. The smell of the orchard just beyond the barn, a mix of ripe pears and soft grass, drifted through the air like a forgotten lullaby. "Remember that summer we painted the barn red?" Henry asked after a stretch of quiet. Clara chuckled. "You mean the summer you painted more of yourself than the barn?" "Well, I wanted to match the roses," he grinned, gesturing to the lush rose bushes at the end of the porch. She reached over and patted his hand. "We were young and foolish. We're old and foolish now. Much better kind of foolish, I'd say." They both laughed, the kind of deep, familiar laughter that only comes after decades of private jokes and shared memories. Clara looked out at the distant fields, where the golden tips of the grass swayed like waves. "Everything feels slower now," she said softly. "That's the best part," Henry said. "You and me, and all the time in the world." They sat like that for a long while. Occasionally, a breeze would rattle the wind chimes hanging near the door, old silver spoons Clara had tied together with string. The sound was light and whimsical, like laughter from another time. Chickens wandered up the steps briefly, peering at the couple before strutting off again in search of adventure. After a while, Clara leaned her head on Henry's shoulder. "Do you ever miss the noise?" she asked. "The tractors? The kids running through the house? The cows escaping the fence every other Tuesday? All of it." He thought for a moment. "I think I miss the chaos sometimes, but I love the stillness more." She nodded. "Me too." They watched as a truck drove slowly past the edge of the property, kicking up dust in its wake. The mailman waved. They waved back. Nothing urgent, nothing loud, just neighbors being neighbors. Clara smiled suddenly. "Do you remember the first time we danced on this porch?" Henry laughed. "During the rainstorm, we were soaked through. You still twirled me, even though the floor was slick. You wore that blue dress, the one with the little white buttons down the back." She looked at him with a spark in her eye. "You remember that? I remember every moment I've ever had with you." And then, for no other reason than because it felt right, Clara stood up and offered her hand. "Dance with me now." He raised an eyebrow. "No music. We don't need it." Henry stood slowly, his old joints groaning a little in protest, but his heart moving like it always had when she asked him to dance. He took her hand, pulled her close, and they swayed there on the porch. Two wrinkled hands clasped, her cheek pressed to his chest, the world around them still and golden. The breeze played their song. The chimes kept rhythm. The farm watched over them like it always had. When they sat down again, the coffee had cooled slightly, but it didn't matter. The apple pie was ready soon after, and they shared a slice, laughing at how crooked Clara's crust had turned out this time. Henry told her it was the best pie he'd ever had. She rolled her eyes, but her cheeks turned a shade pinker. As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, painting the sky in swirls of peach and lavender, they remained on that porch, rocking slowly, speaking softly, hearts wrapped in memory and stillness. A breeze rustled through the tall corn. The barn doors creaked in the distance. A single star began to twinkle above the trees. It wasn't a grand day. It wasn't the kind you write about in the newspapers, but it was a perfect afternoon, the kind that settles deep in the soul like the last sip of warm coffee. And for Clara and Henry, that was more than enough. The little cafe on Maple Street. There was a little cafe tucked between a flower shop and an old bookstore on Maple Street, where the scent of roasted beans and warm bread lingered like a fond memory. It was the kind of place people often stumbled upon by accident and returned to on purpose. The sign above the door read Rosie's Roastery, hand-painted in swirling cursive letters. The paint chipped just enough to suggest a long, happy history. Ivy curled up the stone wall beside it, its leaves fluttering slightly in the breeze, like the cafe itself was breathing. Inside, time moved slower. The wooden floor creaked comfortably underfoot, and the furniture was a welcoming mishmash of cozy armchairs, soft cushioned booths, and little round tables topped with flickering tea candles in colored glass jars. Every surface was decorated with love. Little bookshelves stacked with secondhand novels, napkin holders filled with handwritten poems left behind by patrons, and ceramic sugar bowls that never matched, but always felt just right. The air was filled with the low hum of mellow jazz, the faint whir of grinders, and the occasional hiss and sigh of steam from the espresso machine, punctuated by soft laughter and warm greetings. Rosie herself was the soul of the place. A woman in her 60s with wild silver curls tied up in a loose bun, eyes the color of warm caramel, and hands that moved with practiced kindness. She wore a long green apron embroidered with daisies and tulips, and every morning she greeted the cafe like an old friend, running her fingers lovingly over the counter, turning on the soft yellow lights, and opening the windows just a crack to let in the smell of morning leaves and distant rain. On this particular afternoon, the golden light of early autumn filtered through the tall windows, casting dappled shadows over the customers who had come to spend their time in quiet peace. Outside, the leaves were starting to fall in earnest, scattering across the sidewalk in rich tones of ochre and crimson. The air held that crispness of approaching winter, the kind that made every sip of coffee feel like a small celebration. Harold, the retired watchmaker, sat at his usual table in the back with his spectacles perched on the end of his nose and a tiny humming pocket watch spread open beside a cup of dark roast. His hands trembled slightly now, but his mind was sharp, and he still told stories about the clocks he used to fix, about old halls in London, train stations in Vienna, and a mysterious timepiece that allegedly ran backwards in a Scottish manner. The other patrons adored him, and he had become something of a local treasure. 2 seats over, Nora the teacher was rereading her favorite poetry anthology, her fingers marked with ink, and her eyes lighting up whenever she came across a line she loved. Every so often, she'd jot something into the leather notebook beside her plate of still warm banana bread, torn gently at the edges where she'd nibbled thoughtfully. The couple in the far booth, Liam and Joy, were new parents. They came in every Wednesday while their neighbor watched their infant, and they spent those quiet hours sipping matcha lattes, holding hands across the table, and laughing like they hadn't laughed in years. Joy often brought a puzzle book. Liam always ordered a honey scone. Their presence felt like sunlight after rain. Near the front window, nestled into the most coveted spot, with a view of the street and the sprawling red maple tree just outside, sat Eleanor. She had only recently arrived in town, 3 weeks, though it already felt like a different lifetime. Her life before had been all noise, car horns, meetings, constant screens, and rushed everything. Here, in this little corner of the world, things moved gently. The people were kind without needing a reason. No one asked her what she did. They asked her how she was. She cradled her mocha in both hands, letting the heat sink into her skin as she watched the world beyond the glass. The tree outside danced slowly in the wind, releasing a few golden leaves that spiraled down like confetti. A couple of children passed by, laughing and kicking a pile of leaves into the air. A dog barked once, joyfully, chasing a stick down the sidewalk. All of it, ordinary and beautiful. Rosie appeared beside her with a tiny plate. On it sat a soft, round pastry dusted with powdered sugar. "Apple cider donut," she said, smiling warmly. "Fresh out of the oven. No charge. Consider it a welcome gift." Eleanor blinked, then grinned, something inside her chest loosening. "Thank you, Rosie." "Of course, sweetheart. You're one of us now." The words lingered long after Rosie had returned to the counter. One of us. Eleanor took a bite, the donut warm and sweet with a hint of cinnamon. And for the first time in what felt like years, she didn't feel like she was in between places. She wasn't waiting for something. She was just here. The door jingled again, and in walked a young man with a guitar case and a hesitant smile. Rosie waved him over, pointing to the small wooden stage in the corner. "You still play?" she asked, as if she'd known him all his life. He nodded. "Got a new song, actually." "Well then," she said, "why don't you give it a try? Let's fill this place with something lovely." He stepped onto the stage, adjusted the mic, and began to play. A soft melody filled the cafe, like honey spilling from a jar. Gentle, heartfelt, full of quiet wonder. Conversations paused, heads turned. Eleanor closed her eyes and leaned back into her chair, letting the music carry her like a gentle wave. Outside, the clouds shifted, and a brief stream of sunlight poured across the street, illuminating the leaves, the window panes, the whole front of the cafe in a golden wash. Inside, every heart seemed to sigh contentedly. For that moment, just that moment, there was no past or future. There was only the present, steeped in cinnamon and coffee, soft music, and shared smiles. And the little cafe on Maple Street, with its mismatched chairs and flickering candles, continued on, like a poem being written one afternoon at a time. Perfect, just as it was.